This is TWiT.
So this is a huge story that it just broke today, although we knew it was coming. Basically, the American government, the Department of Justice, is suing Apple for violating antitrust laws. So this is going to be a big story for probably the next decade.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. You know, if everyone remembers Microsoft antitrust law trials many years ago that went on for a very, very long time, this is likely to sort of follow a similar pattern. But just in brief, in case you haven't caught up with the news yet, because this just, the press conference was 11 a.m. Eastern time this morning, and the Department of Justice announced its plans. And basically, they're accusing Apple of illegally monopolizing the smartphone market and using its position, in quotes, to extract more money from consumers, developers, content creators, artists, publishers, small businesses, and merchants. And basically, in the words of the Verge's senior policy reporter, Laura Feiner, the DOJ is saying that Apple has maintained an illegal monopoly over the smartphone market by locking in customers and making experiences worse for rival products, which is a big kick in the face for Apple. And I believe its stock price has already gone down. And the sort of four big parts of this is that they accuse Apple of illegally maintaining its monopoly by disrupting super apps, which are apps that can provide like multiple services on your phone, blocking cloud streaming apps for things like video games, suppressing the quality of messaging between the iPhone and competing platforms like Android. So the whole green bubble, blue bubble issue, and also limiting the functionality. And this is an interesting one that they threw in, functionality of third-party smartwatches. So basically the only watch that works well with an iPhone is an Apple Watch. And the government says that's not fair. And then blocking third-party developers from creating digital wallets. So you could use, Apple Pay, Tap to Pay, you can only use with Apple Pay, you can't use with any other version. So this is a huge, big antitrust lawsuit, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this pans out. Apple has responded and has said, this lawsuit threatens who we are and the principles that set Apple products apart in fiercely competitive markets. And again, this is quoting Fred Sains of Apple. If successful, it will hinder our ability to create the kind of technology people expect from Apple, where hardware, software, and services intersect. And it would also set a dangerous precedent, empowering government to take a heavy hand in designing people's technology. We believe this lawsuit is wrong on the facts and the law, and we will vigorously defend against it.
Oof.
So
it's on.
That's my story of the week.
Yeah.
What do you think, Mikah?
Just that little thing.
Just a small one. So for my first show, welcome.
Make it easy. This is obviously, as you point out, it's going to be big. This is something that we are going to continue to watch over the coming years, because yes, there is going to be a back and forth. I think what's most interesting to me is we've seen a lot of this happening in the EU already, right? We have a little bit of precedent here in the way that the EU is kind of forcing Apple to do certain things. And
with the Digital Markets Act.
Exactly, with the Digital Markets Act. And what I find fascinating there is almost seeing the US kind of let the EU go first, and then going, okay, now we're kind of seeing how they're going to respond, how Apple's going to respond, what they might do. And now it feels like the right time. Look, the troubling, not troubling, but the one thing that I'm kind of paying attention to, I guess, is that when it comes to, for some reason, these smartphone platforms, especially Android and iOS, which are two of the main platforms, you have a lot of people who are fiercely loyal to these companies, to these brands. And in that way, in a world where everybody is I shouldn't even say a little, is far more connected and is far more aware of ways to make their voice heard, I am fascinated to see how that shapes what's going forward. Because when Microsoft was going through it, yes, you had you had Microsoft itself that was involved, and then in many ways you had the businesses who at the time were relying on Microsoft playing a role. But I would say that the average person was probably not as invested in this or paying attention to this. And to a certain extent, it's still true that the average person is not. But I think there's at least one more group of people that is, it's almost like from the center. You've got Apple itself, and then you've got the businesses, and then you've got the kind of early adopters, prosumer space, and then in some cases, even the consumer space. Whereas before with Microsoft, it was kind of like Microsoft itself and then the businesses that cared about it. You didn't have those extra rings that, of course, get bigger because it's more numerous as you go out. And so I think that's going to be fascinating. Is this going to be a call your lawmaker kind of situation, how Apple will play that? Because we saw that with TikTok, right? TikTok, and that's still
TikTok
ongoing.
Got young people to pick up the phone.
They got them to pick up the phone,
Make a phone call.
I thought only Taylor Swift could do
Power
that,
of
but
tech.
apparently, TikTok can as well. They can put out a prompt.
Yes, but then that just proved their point. That they are so influenced by TikTok that they would actually go and make a phone call.
It was a bad move, I think, on their part. But it was also, look, it's a little bit of both, because it was like, yes, it proves the point, but also, holy cow, look at the power that it has.
These people care.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Now with this, Apple has made some changes already to its platforms.
Begrudgingly,
absolutely. I thought it was interesting talking about the cloud streaming stuff, because Apple did just recently change policy on cloud streaming apps for games to make that more available. And then also there was another one that stuck out for me, and now I'm forgetting what it was, but
iMessage?
Yeah, that's right. Because they did say that pretty soon RCS was going to be available on the platform.
So that will get rid of one of the things that they called out actually was in the complaint, which you can read and is like very long.
It is.
But starts with a great story about using a Kindle, and I was very impressed. It wasn't as dry as normally would find in these types of documents, but they were definitely trying to paint a picture and tell their story. But they point out that videos are grainy on, if you're receiving from Android or versus iPhone, and there's, low quality. And so things like that, I believe Apple has already said it's going to start addressing. So, but in all of this these have all been issues that people have had for a long time. I think the volume, the noise around it is gradually getting louder. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the biggest problem with this lawsuit is that Apple does not have a monopoly in the smartphone market. It is not the largest competitor anywhere in the world in its space. It's huge in the States, but it is not the dominant, like it doesn't blow everyone else out of the water. They do have competition in the States. They have much more competition in the rest of the world, where iPhones aren't subsidized in the same way as they are here. It's much easier to buy an iPhone here than it is in Europe. If you don't have $1,000 on hand, because you can get subsidized through the carrier, that's not something that you get in the EU. So I just feel like on the law, and I am not a lawyer. If you want to hear a good lawyer talk about this, make sure to tune into the Vergecast this weekend, because Nilay Patel, my boss, will be on there talking about it a lot, I'm sure. And he is a lawyer. But yes, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that is going to be the biggest issue here, trying to prove that actually Apple is the most dominant in its category. Because that's going to be, that is going to be a hard sell. I think that's going to be the biggest sort of hurdle to overcome. But on the flip side, I do think that what's happened here that's really interesting, and this is what's happened with the Digital Market Acts and all of the other things that we've started to see coming into play around tech. Because it's not just Apple this is happening to. Google is going through similar issues with the EU and the DOJ. Amazon constantly is under these types of investigations and trials. And so there's a lot going on with the big tech companies. And I think what's happening here is this fundamental shift from technology being something that's part of our lives that we all enjoy and use, to technology being fundamental to life.
Yeah.
And because of that, it's no longer it should no longer be allowed to be run entirely independently by these massive companies, all of which, I would love to think have great ambitions to better humanity,
right.
But ultimately they have a bottom line.
Yes, it's about the
they
money.
have shareholders. And I come from Europe. I'm from England, which was in Europe. And, government regulation is much larger part of your world in Europe than it is here. I grew up with, nationalized health service, nationalized rail service, telecommunications, and you have regulations here over telecommunications, TV, cable. Ultimately, cell phones, the internet, mobile phones are so important to everyday life now, much more so than they were even 10 years ago. Like, you cannot realistically I had to get my child a cell phone so she could go to school.
Right.
Like, there are things she couldn't do without a phone. I didn't want to get her a phone because she was too young, but she couldn't check her grades if she didn't have a phone. It's gotten to the point where you have to have these devices. So we really do need some form of government regulation over some of these areas to make sure that everyone can have access to what is essentially now become incredibly essential to daily life, just like electricity and plumbing. I mean, it's where technology has brought us. So while this may not be, this isn't regulation, but this is certainly a step towards something larger. Step is going to be a very slow step because I think this is going to take a very long time. But I feel like this was inevitable, basically.
It was. I think it was inevitable. And here's what has always kind of confused me about big tech in particular. Because you talked about the necessities, these different services that we decided were just necessary for daily life, and how because of that they were all regulated in the United States, and far longer regulated in other places. And when the movie industry, when Hollywood was getting underway, and by extension, the music industry was also kind of getting into a place of being more of a large scale business. Those organizations realized we are going to be faced with the government coming in and regulating us. And we don't really want that to happen. So we're going to regulate ourselves. And they set up rules and regulatory bodies that put in place things like the ratings systems on movies and TV, and, proved time and time again that no matter what, they would regulate their stuff, even if it didn't necessarily, benefit them. And I have remained surprised that we didn't see that. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. The optimistic part of myself that wants to believe that everybody's out there to do good and better humanity remained surprised that big tech did not choose to regulate themselves. Unfortunately, there is another part of me that's more realistic and a little bit pessimistic that's going, well, duh, of course they didn't. But as it's been up to this point, there's not this overall regulation, and that the big tech didn't get together and go, you know what, we should do this instead of trying to fight every single time something comes up. But they've been able to thus far. And I think that's where maybe it's time for a bit of an ego check. And I understand the argument. I get why people have this argument, and particularly these companies themselves, that, if government gets involved, then they're just going to ruin everything and it's all going to go poorly and we'll never be able to innovate ever again and yada, 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 yada. I understand where that comes from, but there's still innovation that takes place when there are at least guardrails in place. And I honestly...
Guardrails are very key, yes.
And I want some of the stuff, I don't necessarily want all of it, but I want some of the stuff that the EU has now when it comes to Apple. I like some of the things that have been required and wish that they were here in the US. And I think that this like
the alternate app stores and the
browser selection. That more than anything,
deleting
honestly.
Default apps. Yeah, there's a lot that's interesting there. I mean, it certainly feels like the DMA is going to do a bit more than the GDPR did. GDPR, we end up with cookies pages.
Oof.
That's it.
Yeah.
I feel like, but I'm sure there's more to it, but
that's what it feels like for us.
It hasn't felt, to the consumer, there's not a lot of change. It doesn't feel. With the DMA, it feels like there is going to be significant change for a certain type of consumer. This feels even bigger in terms, especially because Americans, the green bubble, blue bubble thing is an American issue. Just to make this clear, that is not an issue in Europe because no one uses anything other than WhatsApp in Europe or the rest of the world. So the green bubble, blue bubble thing, it seems to be what they're very much hanging their hat on here. And it's a frustrating, that's a core communication issue. And it, again, going back to like fundamental kind of things that you need to live in this world. It's sad that we've kind of got to that point, but you need to be able to text people. You need to be able to communicate that way. And if there are barriers there should be options to remove those barriers. And Apple has not provided enough change in this space, clearly, for the US government. So no, in terms of regulation though, I think I understand where you're coming from and I agree. But to be fair, if you look at what the music and the movie industry had to do, was relatively small.
Yeah.
These tech companies have their fingers in almost all parts of our lives.
That's a good point.
You've got AI, you've got communication, you've got, banking, entertainment. They're gatekeepers, to use a phrase from the DMA, for a lot of what we do on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. So it would require an awful lot of resources to create some kind of, regulation themselves, and they'd all have to work together, which we've seen they can do because, I am a smart home reporter and I have to mention Matter every time on the show. But we've seen that these companies can work together to help solve a problem in the industry, but it is a big process to do that. And it takes a lot of time. And for Matter, which is a relatively small fry, which is a smart home interoperability protocol, that's taken years. Mm-hmm. And it's nothing as complicated as many of the issues that this antitrust lawsuit is going to address and bring up. And this is also, as we mentioned, sort of a small slice of how important having a phone is in everyday life. And I think that's kind of, to me, where I've only spent a couple hours this morning kind of digesting all of this news, and I'm going to be really interested to read and hear everyone's hot takes over the next few days. But this is what it comes down to, is that the smartphone has become, in 10 years, such an integral part of our life that, we can't trust companies as much as, I love Apple. I know you love Apple.
Right.
I also like other companies too. I like to use a Google Pixel. I think Google does some great stuff. I like, a lot of what Amazon does. I'm a big fan of their smart displays. There's, these pieces of technology are so important in our lives these days, but nothing is more important than your phone. It's kind of sad. I hate to admit it, but you do, it has such a large role in your life. So, I'm not sure that what this antitrust lawsuit is doing is necessarily going to solve a lot of these issues, but I think what it is going to do is open up really important conversations that we can start talking about how we need to regulate or, put into place some guardrails over how dependent we are on these devices and the services that they offer, and how we can be protected against the future. Because one of the big issues with any kind of regulation is you're generally regulating for the past, right? It's so hard, especially with technology, to know what's going to happen with technology. I got my first iPhone 10 years ago, and pretty much all it did was make phone calls. Now, the one thing I really don't do with my phone is make phone calls.
Exactly. Yeah. But it does so much.
It's changed a lot.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And especially as we're seeing things shift so quickly with AI and Gen AI, and being able to, that's generative AI, not
Not
for
me.
AI. Yeah. As opposed to, even in comparison, smartphone took a long time, so to speak, to reach what it has in comparison to AI. And very, very, very solid point there about how we're kind of regulating to the past. And that means with generative AI especially, that means being left in the dust in a lot of ways. So I understand these governmental bodies wanting to get out in front of it, because that's the role that they're supposed to play. Thanks so much for watching this little chunk of Tech News Weekly. If you'd like to get the full episode, well, head over to twit.tv/TNW. There you'll find buttons you can click or tap to subscribe to the entire show in audio and video formats. Or just look in the description. We've got links down there as well.